July 23, 1944. Eastern Front, 17 kilometers west of Minsk. The mortar fragment entered Karl Weber's right thigh with the sound of tearing fabric, a whisper against the thunder of artillery that had been shaking the birch forest for 6 hours. He didn't scream. Officers of the Wehrmacht didn't scream. But when he looked down and saw the dark bloom spreading across his field gray trousers, saw the unnatural angle of his shin, saw splinters of his own tibia pressing against the fabric like tent poles, then he understood that screaming would have been useless anyway. The July heat pressed down like a physical weight. 31 degrees Celsius. Weber could smell his own blood mixing with the peaty earth, with cordite smoke, with the peculiar sweetness of shattered pine. His mouth tasted of copper. Around him the remnants of his motorized unit, what remained of 3rd Platoon after the Soviet offensive had torn through their defensive line like paper, fired sporadic bursts into the encroaching tree line. But Weber knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes with severe trauma, that they were already finished. Quote, Gefreiter Holtz crawled to his side, face white beneath the dirt. Quote, 1, quote, 2. Weber's voice came out steadier than he expected. He pressed both hands against his thigh, feeling the hot pulse of arterial bleeding beneath his fingers. The bone fragments ground together with each breath. Pain arrived in waves. First hot, then cold, then something beyond temperature altogether. He thought of his father's surgical theater in Cologne, the smell of carbolic acid and starched linen, the ordered calm of German medicine. He had watched his father amputate a gangrenous leg once when he was 14. Clean, efficient, final. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might require the same procedure now. We're surrounded, sir. Holtz's voice cracked. Quote 4. Weber looked at his watch, a Lange and Söhne his grandfather had carried through the previous war. 1,400 hours. They had been fighting since 0800. His medical kit contained 4 morphine syrettes. He had already used one. The recommended dose for a wound like this would be 3, perhaps 4. That left him with enough to manage consciousness for perhaps 6 more hours. After that, shock. After shock in this heat with this bleeding, gangrene within 24 hours. Death within 48 if infection didn't claim him sooner. But it was the bone damage that terrified him most. Not the pain. Pain was temporary. It was the knowledge of what shattered bone meant, what fragments of metal embedded in tissue meant, what vascular damage in a combat zone meant, amputation or death. Those were the only outcomes he had been taught to expect. The surrender came at 1,600 hours. Weber would remember it in fragments like his own shattered bone. Soviet voices, sharp and commanding. The metallic click of rifles being set down. Holtz's hands lifting him, the world tilting sickeningly. Blood leaving a trail in the dust. The faces of enemy soldiers, younger than he expected, harder than propaganda had painted them, looking at his leg with expressions he couldn't read. Not hatred, not satisfaction. Something closer to professional assessment. They bound his leg roughly but not cruelly. Someone gave him water. When he tried to speak Russian, the few phrases he'd learned from a dictionary in another lifetime, a Soviet medic shook his head and said, in broken German, Quote 5. American. Weber's mind, sliding in and out of morphine fog, tried to process this. Americans. Here? He had heard rumors of Western supplies flowing through Lend-Lease, of American advisors, of a coordination that German intelligence insisted was exaggerated. But American hospitals? For prisoners. He passed out before he could ask. The prison camp materialized through fever and delirium. Weber retained only sensations from those first 48 hours. The jolting of a truck bed, the smell of gangrene beginning its creep through his tissue, the cold certainty that he would lose the leg. Officers didn't discuss amputation in medical terms. They discussed it in terms of honor. A one-legged man couldn't march, couldn't lead, couldn't embody the physical ideal of the military caste he'd been raised to represent. His father's voice echoed through the morphine dreams. The body is a machine, Karl. When a component fails beyond repair, you remove it. Quickly, cleanly, before it contaminates the whole system. Contamination. That's what he was now. A contaminated component awaiting removal. The camp hospital announced itself first through smell, antiseptic sharp enough to cut through his fever, then through light, electric bulbs, not oil lamps, turning night into an artificial day, then through sound, English voices, brisk and efficient, discussing him as though he were a mechanical problem to be solved rather than an enemy to be punished. Quote 7. The voice belonged to a man in his 40s, American accent, wearing captain's bars and a medical caduceus. How long since injury? 68 hours, sir. Another voice, younger. Jesus! Surprised he's not septic yet. Get him prepped. We're going in tonight. Weber's English was good, better than most Wehrmacht officers, good enough to understand that they were discussing surgery, good enough to understand Warsta's quote 11. Not good enough, in his fever-addled state, to understand what kind of surgery they meant. He assumed amputation. What else could they mean? Captain James Thornton of the U.S. Army Medical Corps came to see him 2 hours before the operation. Weber was lucid by then. The Americans had given him something for the fever, something that cleared his head without removing the pain. He lay in a ward with 16 other beds, 8 occupied, 3 Americans, 2 British, 3 Germans, no walls between them, no separation. This itself was shocking. Quote 12. Thornton sat in a chair beside the bed, medical file open on his lap. His uniform was crisp despite the summer heat. Quote 13. Quote 14. Weber's voice rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. Good. Here's the situation. You've got extensive damage to your right femur and tibia. Normally, and I'll be frank with you, normally in a combat situation, with this kind of trauma and this much time elapsed, we'd be looking at amputation. Cut our losses, save your life. Move on. Weber nodded. This was what he expected, what he'd been preparing himself to accept. The loss of the leg, the loss of his future, the transformation from officer to invalid. Quote 16. Thornton leaned forward. Quote 17. Weber blinked. The words didn't arrange themselves into meaning at first. We're going to attempt a reconstruction, Thornton continued. It's complicated, high risk. It's going to involve removing the bone fragments and necrotic tissue. That's the dead tissue that's starting to go septic. Then we'll reconnect the damaged blood vessels, restore blood flow to the lower leg. After that, we'll reconstruct the muscle and fascia, the connective tissue, and finally stabilize the bone using external fixation and what we call bone grafting. Bone grafting? Weber's German medical vocabulary was extensive, but this term was new. Quote 21. Weber stared at him. Quote 22, quote 23, quote 24, quote 25. The silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the ward, someone coughed. An American soldier was singing quietly, some jazz tune Weber didn't recognize. The normalcy of it felt surreal. Why? Weber finally asked. The question contained multitudes. Why save an enemy officer's leg? Why invest resources, time, expertise? Why treat him like a human being rather than a component to be disposed of? Thornton's expression didn't change. Quote 27. They operated for 7 hours. Weber went under anesthesia expecting to wake with one leg. Instead, he woke to find both still attached, though his right leg was immobilized in an elaborate external framework that looked like something between a bird cage and a torture device. The pain was extraordinary. Different from the initial trauma, this was deeper, more invasive, the pain of tissue cut and rearranged and forced into new configurations. But through the pain, through the morphine haze, Weber could feel his toes, could flex them, slightly, could feel the pulse of blood moving through restored vessels. His leg was still there, damaged, reconstructed, but there. A nurse, American, red-haired, perhaps 25, checked his vitals with brisk efficiency. Quote 28, quote 29. Weber managed. She smiled slightly. Quote 30. She left. Weber lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. The propaganda he'd absorbed, consciously and unconsciously, for 12 years had prepared him for many things. It had prepared him for American material superiority. Everyone knew they had more tanks, more planes, more supplies. It had prepared him for American ruthlessness. The air raids on German cities spoke to that. But it hadn't prepared him for American medicine that treated enemy officers like human beings worth reconstructing. Recovery became its own education. The ward operated on rhythms that defied Weber's military experience. American wounded and German prisoners received identical care. Same medications, same feeding schedules, same visiting hours for Red Cross representatives. The American soldiers didn't fraternize with the Germans exactly, but neither did they demonstrate the hatred Weber expected. Quote 31 said one American private, Kowalski from Chicago, recovering from a bullet wound to the shoulder. Quote 32. Quote 33, Weber replied cautiously. Quote 34, quote 35, quote 36, Kowalski laughed. Quote 37. Despite himself, Weber felt his mouth twitch. Quote 38, quote 39. It was a peculiar friendship, if it could be called that. Conversations about nothing. Baseball, which Weber didn't understand. German philosophy, which Kowalski pretended to understand. The weather, the food, the monotony of recovery. Never about the war directly. Never about why they'd been trying to kill each other 3 weeks earlier. But the friendship, or whatever it was, forced Weber to confront uncomfortable questions. Kowalski was 22. Had worked in a steel mill before the war, liked jazz music and hated hospital food, and missed his girlfriend with an intensity that made Weber, who had no girlfriend, feel something like envy. In German propaganda, Americans were supposed to be soft, materialistic, lacking the spiritual depth that supposedly characterized the German soul. Kowalski didn't seem soft. He seemed tired, human, ordinary. Dr. Thornton visited daily. The reconstruction was holding. New bone was forming around the grafts. Visible on the X-rays, he showed Weber, pointing out the calcification with evident satisfaction. The external fixation frame would stay in place for 8 to 12 weeks, then be replaced with a cast. Physical therapy would begin in week 6, full weight bearing in perhaps 6 months. In Berlin, Weber said during one of these visits, the largest hospitals, Charité, the university clinics, they don't do this kind of surgery, not for combat wounds. Why? Thornton considered the question. Different priorities, maybe. Different philosophy of medical care. Germany has excellent surgeons. Your father's generation trained some of the best. But the military medical system got shaped by different pressures. Speed, efficiency, getting soldiers back to the front or out of the system. Amputation serves those goals. And American medicine? We got shaped by different pressures. We've got industrial capacity that lets us build hospitals like this one. We've got enough surgeons that we can specialize. Orthopedics, vascular surgery, reconstructive work. We've got blood banks, antibiotics, surgical teams who can spend 7 hours on one operation. He paused. Maybe we're wasteful, inefficient, but we save more legs. And why German legs? Why enemy legs? Thornton's expression hardened slightly. Quote 47. Quote 48. Quote 49. The psychological transformation came slowly. Weber had been raised in a world of clear hierarchies, absolute loyalties, unquestioned sacrifices. Officers didn't show weakness. Germans didn't accept help from enemies. The injured were either returned to duty or retired quietly, their missing limbs a badge of honor that also marked them as essentially finished. But his leg was being saved by enemy doctors. He was receiving care equal to enemy wounded. He was being treated consistently and without exception as a human being whose leg mattered. The cognitive dissonance was painful in ways morphine couldn't touch. At night, when the ward was quiet except for the groans of the wounded and the soft footsteps of nurses, Weber lay awake and tried to reconcile his new reality with his old certainties. He had been told repeatedly and through multiple channels that German medicine was superior, that German organizational efficiency was unmatched, that Germans possessed a cultural and spiritual depth that other nations lacked. But here was American medicine saving his leg with techniques German hospitals didn't use. Here was American organization running a hospital that treated all wounded equally. Here were American doctors demonstrating a depth of human compassion that German propaganda insisted Americans were incapable of. One of these narratives had to be wrong. Week 6 brought physical therapy and a new level of confrontation with reality. Lieutenant Mary Hutchins, physical therapist, was 31 from Boston and possessed the kind of cheerful ruthlessness that made injured soldiers simultaneously grateful and terrified. She appeared at Weber's bedside with a walker and an expression that suggested negotiation was not an option. "Time to start moving, Lieutenant. We've got your leg put back together. Now we need to teach it how to work again." The first session was humiliating. Weber, who had marched 20 kilometers in a day during training, couldn't walk 5 meters without his vision graying at the edges. The reconstructed leg felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, unresponsive, sending signals that didn't quite make sense. "That's normal," Hutchins said, supporting him. "Your nerves are still healing. Your muscles are still figuring out the new architecture. Give it time." "How much time?" "Months. Maybe a year before you're walking normally. Maybe longer before you're running, but you'll walk, Lieutenant. That leg's going to work." During one session, another German prisoner was brought in, Hauptmann Dieter Richter, whose right arm had been shattered by shrapnel and reconstructed using similar techniques. Richter was further along in recovery, could already bear weight, could demonstrate the future Weber was working toward. "They saved your leg," Richter said in German, voice low. "Mine too. Arm, in my case. In any German field hospital, I'd have lost it. Clean amputation, quick recovery, sent home with a medal and a pension." "You sound—" Weber hesitated. "Grateful?" "I am grateful, but I'm also angry." Richter's expression was complex. Quote 60, quote 61, quote 62. The conversation stayed with Weber. Richter had articulated something he'd been feeling but couldn't name. It wasn't just gratitude for the surgery. It was anger at the system that wouldn't have performed it. It was betrayal, not by the Americans who had captured him, but by the German system that had taught him amputation was the only option. By week 12, Weber could walk short distances with a cane. The external fixation frame had been removed. His leg was encased in a cast from hip to ankle. The X-rays showed solid bone formation, healthy vasculature, successful integration of the grafts. Dr. Thornton called it one of his best outcomes. Quote 63, he said frankly. Quote 64, quote 65. Weber said slowly, quote 66, quote 67, quote 68. Thornton's expression was careful. "That's above my pay grade, Lieutenant. I'm a doctor, not a politician, but I know that countries survive wars. Even when they lose them, people survive. Life continues. And you'll be part of that continuation." The war ended on May 8, 1945. Weber heard the news in the prison hospital, now exclusively for German wounded awaiting repatriation. The ward erupted in a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the killing was over. Grief for what was lost, cities, lives, the future they'd been promised. Weber felt mostly numb. He'd had 10 months to process the collapse of the narratives that had structured his life. 10 months watching his leg heal through techniques German hospitals hadn't offered. 10 months receiving care from enemy doctors who treated him with more humanity than his own military system would have shown. When the Red Cross representative came to process his papers, she asked the standard questions: name, rank, hometown, relatives to notify, special needs. Quote 70, Weber said. She looked up, surprised. Quote 71, quote 72, quote 73, quote 74. Weber returned to Cologne in June 1945. The city was ruins. His father's clinic was gone, bombed in a 43 raid. His father was dead, heart attack in 44. His mother lived in 3 rooms of what had been their house, sharing space with 2 other families. She wept when she saw him walk through the door on his cane. They said you'd lost the leg. The Red Cross notification said severe combat wound, expected disability. I thought, American doctors saved it, Weber said. Used techniques we don't have here. Reconstructive surgery, vascular repair, bone grafting. It took 7 hours and 10 months of recovery, but they saved it. His mother touched his face, tracing the lines that hadn't been there 2 years earlier. Quote 78, quote 79. He spent the first week simply trying to survive, finding food, locating former colleagues, understanding what was left of the medical infrastructure. Germany was a wasteland, physically and institutionally. Hospitals were destroyed or crippled, medical supplies were scarce, doctors were dead, displaced or demoralized. But Weber had something most of them didn't, a vision of what medicine could be. He began speaking publicly in 1946, small venues at first, veterans groups, medical society meetings, university gatherings. He told his story simply. German officer, combat wound, American Reconstruction, return on 2 legs instead of 1. Quote 80. He would say, quote 81. The reactions were mixed. Some veterans resented the implication that German medicine was inferior. Some doctors bristled at criticism of their wartime practices. But others, particularly younger doctors, the ones trying to rebuild medicine from ruins, listened. Quote 82, they said. Quote 83. Weber described what he remembered and what he'd learned. The 7-hour operation, the external fixation frames, the bone grafting, the vascular repair, the muscle reconstruction. He admitted freely that he wasn't a surgeon, that his knowledge was a patient's knowledge, incomplete and experiential. But I know it's possible, he said. I know that legs that would have been amputated under our system were saved under theirs. I know that dignity and function were preserved where we would have sacrificed them for efficiency. And I know we can learn to do the same. Hauptmann Richter, whose arm had been saved through similar reconstruction, joined him in this advocacy. Together they became unlikely voices for medical reform. 2 former Wehrmacht officers arguing that Germany needed to learn from Allied medicine. This isn't about admitting defeat, Richter said during one contentious meeting with medical administrators. It's about admitting that other countries developed techniques we need. We lost the war. That's done. But we don't have to lose the peace by refusing to learn. The resistance was substantial. Weber had expected gratitude, even admiration for his advocacy. Instead, he encountered suspicion, resentment, and active hostility. Some veterans accused him of betraying German honor by praising Allied medicine. Some doctors accused him of oversimplifying complex medical decisions. Some military officials suggested that his time as a prisoner had compromised his loyalty. You talk like an American propaganda officer, one colonel said during a particularly heated exchange, suggesting German medicine was inadequate, that our doctors didn't do everything possible. I'm not suggesting they didn't do everything possible within their system, Weber replied evenly. I'm suggesting the system itself was flawed, that we prioritized the wrong outcomes, that we could have saved more legs, more function, more futures, if we'd had different techniques and different priorities. Based on what? Your experience as a prisoner, one operation. Based on the fact that I'm standing here on 2 legs when every German doctor would have amputated. Based on the fact that reconstructive techniques exist that we weren't using. Based on the fact that medicine shouldn't be subordinated to military efficiency. The exchange didn't win him friends, but it clarified his position. He wasn't attacking individual doctors. He was attacking a system that had prioritized speed and efficiency over preservation and restoration. The breakthrough came in 1948. The Marshall Plan was bringing not just economic aid, but also technical expertise. American and British medical advisors began working with German hospitals, sharing techniques, training surgeons, introducing new approaches. Weber found himself positioned perfectly. A German officer who could speak knowledgeably about Allied medical techniques, who had experienced them firsthand, who could translate between American approaches and German contexts. He was hired as a consultant to help introduce reconstructive surgical techniques to German hospitals. It wasn't a glamorous position, more bureaucratic than he'd imagined, full of committee meetings and budget negotiations and institutional resistance. But it was real. It was progress. "We're bringing in external fixation equipment," he explained to a group of skeptical surgeons in Munich. "It's expensive initially, but it saves costs long-term by reducing amputations. We're also introducing systematic approaches to bone grafting, vascular repair, muscle reconstruction. These aren't experimental techniques. The Americans have been using them for 5 years with good success rates." "And you think we can replicate their results?" "I think we have to try. We have thousands of wounded veterans who were told amputation was their only option. Some of them might still be candidates for reconstruction, and for future injuries, accidents, industrial trauma, whatever comes, we need to have these capabilities." The resistance was real, but so was the need. Germany in the late 40s was full of amputees, many of them young men who'd been told their limbs couldn't be saved. Weber became a spokesperson for the possibility of restoration, not just of limbs, but of futures. By 1950, reconstructive orthopedic surgery was being taught in major German medical schools. It wasn't universal. Many hospitals still defaulted to amputation for complex trauma. Many doctors still resisted techniques that came from former enemies. But the change was beginning. Weber received a letter from Dr. Thornton in 1951. It was brief, friendly, professional. Quote 98. Weber kept the letter. He would read it during difficult moments, the committee meetings that went nowhere, the budget rejections, the veterans who accused him of dishonoring their sacrifices by suggesting better treatment was possible. He would read it and remember, he was standing on 2 legs. That was proof. That was evidence. That was the argument that couldn't be refuted. Weber died in 1988 at age 70. By then, reconstructive orthopedic surgery was standard practice in German hospitals. External fixation, bone grafting, vascular repair, the techniques that had saved his leg in a prisoner hospital were now routine procedures performed on German citizens by German doctors. His obituary in the medical journals noted his service record, his injury, his advocacy work. But what it couldn't capture was the more subtle transformation, the slow shift in how German medicine understood its obligations to the wounded. Before Weber's advocacy, amputation was often presented as the heroic option, the quick, efficient solution that got soldiers back to dignity through acceptance of loss. After his advocacy, preservation became the heroic goal, the difficult, time-consuming work of restoration. It wasn't just about surgical techniques. It was about what medicine owed to patients. It was about whether the goal was efficiency or restoration. It was about whether losing part of yourself was an acceptable price to pay for institutional convenience. In the summer of 2003, a young German orthopedic surgeon named Martin Braun performed a complex reconstruction on a motorcycle accident victim. The injury was severe. Multiple bone fragments, vascular damage, extensive soft tissue destruction. In earlier decades, amputation would have been automatic, but Braun spent 9 hours reconstructing the leg. Using external fixation and bone grafting and vascular repair, the patient recovered fully, walked without a limp, returned to work. Braun had never heard of Karl Weber. He'd learned the techniques as standard procedure in medical school, taught by professors who'd learned them from professors who'd learned them from the first generation of post-war reformers. He didn't know that every step of the procedure he'd performed had once been controversial, that introducing these techniques to German medicine had required years of advocacy by a former Wehrmacht officer whose own leg had been saved by enemy doctors. He didn't know that his patient walking on 2 legs was a direct result of a decision made in a prisoner hospital 59 years earlier, a decision to treat a wounded German officer as a human being worth reconstructing rather than a component worth discarding. He didn't know the history, but he performed the procedure, and that perhaps was exactly what Weber had worked for, not to be remembered, but to make remembering unnecessary, to make reconstruction so routine, so standard, so obviously correct that future doctors would never question whether it was worth the time and effort to save a leg. The mortar fragment that entered Karl Weber's thigh on July 23, 1944, changed more than just his leg. It changed his understanding of medicine, of dignity, of what enemies could offer each other even in the midst of war. It changed his understanding of institutional loyalty, revealing that loyalty to a system might conflict with loyalty to human welfare. It changed his understanding of honor, revealing that accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Most importantly, it changed German medicine, not immediately, not completely, but significantly, because Weber returned from captivity carrying more than just a reconstructed leg. He carried evidence that different approaches were possible. That amputation wasn't inevitable, that preservation could be prioritized over efficiency, that medicine could be about restoration rather than just triage. He spent 40 years translating that evidence into institutional change. 40 years arguing that the techniques that saved his leg should save other legs. 40 years fighting the comfortable assumption that German medicine already represented the pinnacle of possible care. It was unglamorous work. Committee meetings, budget negotiations, training programs, institutional resistance, slow, incremental progress. But in the end, he won. Not completely, not universally, but substantially. And that victory meant that future German soldiers, future accident victims, future patients with complex trauma would have their legs saved as his had been saved, would walk as he walked, would live as he lived, on two legs, with dignity, with restored function, with futures that amputation would have stolen. That was the legacy of July 23, 1944. Not just one saved leg, but thousands of legs saved over decades. Not just one transformed understanding, but a transformation of understanding throughout an entire medical system. Not just salvation, but systematic, institutional, perpetual salvation. The kind that American doctors had offered him in that prisoner hospital. The kind he had spent a lifetime making available to his own countrymen. The kind that proved, ultimately, that even in the devastation of total war, medicine could transcend nationality, could recognize common humanity, could choose preservation over efficiency, restoration over expedience, life over convenient death. Weber's leg was the proof. His life was the argument. His legacy was the transformation. And 60 years later, when German doctors routinely saved legs that would once have been amputated, they enacted that legacy without even knowing his name, which was perhaps the highest honor he could have received.